Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of the Cedarville Stories podcast. I'm Mark Weinstein, and joining me today is Paul Hembekides, better known as Hembo to those who watch or listen to ESPN. Hembo earned a degree in sport management in 2012 from Cedarville University, and after earning a master's degree from LaSalle University and then working in their sports information office, he landed a dream job at ESPN. Today, he's a content producer for ESPN's Get Up with Mike Greenberg and a co-author of 3 books with Greeny. Hembo began his career as a researcher on the Mike and Mike radio program, to which he's become known as the premier sports researcher in the industry. Paul and his wife, Elizabeth, are the parents of 3 daughters, and it's my pleasure to welcome Paul Hembekides to today's Cedarville Stories podcast. Hey, it's great to have Hembo here with us today on the podcast. Thanks for taking time to join us.
Oh, it's my pleasure. I appreciate the invite.
So, Hembo, your ESPN colleagues love to have fun with you, actually pick on you because of your college baseball career at Cedarville University. What they may not know is during those 4 years that you played, those are the 4 best teams in Cedarville history, and you started 170 games, and in the process set a current all-time record of walks with 128. So let's start off with this. Speaking of the all-time walks leader, what does it take to set that kind of record at a Division II school, even at a Division I school?
Sure. So it's funny because here at ESPN, I've become much more known as the stats guy and as not the former player type, as not the jock type. But I like to remind people on occasion that make fun of me for that I'm probably a more accomplished athlete than you are. Obviously, I'm not a more accomplished athlete than some of our former, professional athletes that, talk about things on TV and the radio. But I do have enough of a college baseball background and expertise in that area that I can do both. And so when you're speaking of that record specifically, there's obviously a couple of things that go into it. It's longevity. It's the ability to play every single day, which I took great pride in. And secondarily, it's patience. It's one's ability to control the strike zone and swing at a good pitch. And it's only when that is within the strike zone. So many times in the game of baseball, at any level, that's the single biggest thing that I think is a determining factor for how good or how bad you might be as a hitter. Do you swing at good pitches and you take bad ones? And for me, because I didn't have much power, I was a sort of punch and Judy middle infielder type. Right. I figured a walk's as good as a hit because in my case, a hit was probably only going to be a single.
That's right. That's right. But I think there's one characteristic you left out. And because I think to be able to manage the strike zone, you have to be a disciplined person. Okay, so let's transfer that into what you're doing now at ESPN. So I'm interested in knowing how you went from your postgraduate education to ESPN. So did patience and discipline come into effect, or how did you secure that job with ESPN, that very first one?
It's a well-made point, and there's no question about it. So I graduated from Cedarville in 2012 with a degree in communication.
Right.
2 years later, I got my master's in education from LaSalle University, which is a school in North Philadelphia near where I grew up. And it just so happens, keep in mind, I was looking to work in that track, in the world of athletics, whether it be as an administrator, whether it be in the world of communications, that kind of thing. That's kind of what I wanted to do until I stumbled across a recruiter from the ESPN Stats and Information Group just by chance at a seminar of sorts. And I'm the kind of person who is probably persistent to a fault. And I recognized an opportunity after meeting this gentleman and sort of hitting it off. I just was going to keep bothering him until I got a chance to get an interview at ESPN. That's truthfully how it went. So there was some discipline and patience, but also a lot of persistence. And so what I like to tell people is that there's truthfully no difference between, my upbringing in the world of sports and yours. Most of my buddies grew up loving sports and consuming it the same way that I did. I just happened to come across an ESPN recruiter at a time in which I was sort of in the industry of looking for a full-time position. And not only did I not let it go, but he and I hit it off. And eventually that's what led to an interview, my getting hired, and the rest, as they say, is history.
So you said how long did it take? How long did it take from when you met this guy to when you were offered the job?
Probably something like 6 months.
Okay, that's pretty standard. And how long have you been at ESPN?
I've been at ESPN for 10 and a half years.
And I've enjoyed following your career. And one thing I've noticed about when you're on a program with Greeny or with Mike Golic when he was there and others, that you have a knack for providing great research that leads to compelling conversations. What's your process? How do you go about finding these small nuggets of truth that lead to great conversations?
So the way that I like to characterize it is this. It is my objective on a daily basis to make our listener, to make our viewers smarter. And the best way to do that is not by flexing my research or statistical muscle. Rather, it's by using that information and the skills that I have, obtained over the years to use numbers to tell a story. Yeah. So instead of saying such and such player ranks third in the NFL on these kinds of throws, it is a much more astute way of presenting the information in a way in which our listeners or viewers might understand by using it as a means of storytelling and not just a stat. So I'll use an example.
Okay.
So last night, the Cincinnati Bengals beat the Dallas Cowboys.
Right.
And as an Eagles fan, that brings me great joy, as you might imagine.
I know.
So the Cincinnati Bengals are now 5-8. Joe Burrow is having one of the best statistical seasons in the NFL, as is his number one wide receiver, Ja'Marr Chase. And so the way I characterized his season is this. The most touchdown passes that anybody ever threw in a non-playoff season is Dan Marino, one of those great quarterbacks of all time. He threw 44 in the year 1986. Right now, through 13 games, Joe Burrow has thrown 33 touchdowns. So he might find himself in the kind of place where Dan Marino, who threw 44 in a non-playoff season, and Drew Brees, who threw 43 in a non-playoff season, that's the kind of company he's in. Joe Burrow's having an MVP level, Hall of Fame caliber season. It just so happens that his defense is failing him. So on one hand, one might look at the standings and say, look, how can this quarterback really be all that valuable? His team is 5-8. Let's peel back the onion a few layers. Let's look at how bad the defense has performed. Let's look at how well Joe Burrow has performed, neutralize the context. And when you do that, what you realize is that he's having an MVP caliber season. It just so happens he's doing so on a 5-8 football team.
So how did you learn to dissect that onion in that way so you can tell a compelling story instead of just going stats?
So when you first arrive at ESPN, in my case, in the Stats and Information Group, you kind of go through the ringer for 6 months. They teach you, whether it be through training or just trial by fire, to learn how to find anything, how to answer any question. And so an anchor, a host, a producer might ask you, when was the last time this happened? Or who owns the record for this? Or what is the likelihood that this team wins each of the next 3 games? Something of that nature, just as 3 of millions of examples of things that you could be asked. And so what you learn to do early on in your time at ESPN in that research capacity is answer questions accurately and be able to answer as many questions across a wide swath of sports and information as accurately as you can. But the more time you spend doing that, the more your ideas begin to percolate and the more you deviate from let's answer this question to let's provide this idea to tell a story. And so now I'm at a point in my career where if an analyst sees something in a game, my friend Dan Orlovsky might ask me, what do the Eagles do on 3rd and long? Because it looks like to me that this team is really unsuccessful. So in addition to providing him an answer, the Eagles rank 18th in that statistic this season. It's going to be demonstrating how Jalen Hurts, the Eagles quarterback, is substandard in plays in which the defense knows that they're obviously going to pass. Yeah. What can that mean? Well, perhaps Jalen Hurts is a product of the system. Maybe Jalen Hurts is over-reliant on the run game. Maybe Jalen Hurts is playing behind a good offensive line and he's making them look bad. The point is, ESPN is and always has been an ideas business. There are many researchers that can answer most any question that you ask them. But there are very few people in this industry that can provide a piece of information that the talent, the analyst, the host can use as a weapon to make a point, to refute a point, or to start a conversation. To me, that's the most valuable way in which a human being can use information after watching something or looking something up. How can it be used to refute a point or to make a point, not simply to tag a conversation or answer a question?
As I follow sports, like I do, probably too much, I do take note of what you're doing. And some people may say that the success of your career maybe is tied to Mike and Mike or Greeny now, which is true. But I want to argue that really you make them look good by giving that content. Is that a fair, humility aside, is that a fair assessment?
Yes, as I like to say, I take great pride in my humility. All kidding aside, it works both ways. I like to say that I have a symbiotic relationship with talent at ESPN, as we call them. These are people that are highly successful in this profession, and they would be highly successful without me. Right. However, as you might expect, any highly successful person in any walk of life it truly does take a village. So what I equip myself, like the challenge that I charge myself with every single day, how can I maximize this person's ability? How can I maximize this segment's effectiveness? How can I maximize this human being's skill set? And so, as you might imagine, I've had the opportunity to work with some of ESPN's most recognizable, most forward-facing people. And I've been with Greeny for 10 years now. And that's a relationship that has been extremely prosperous for me too, of course. I mean, Greeny and I have written 3 books together. Greeny and I have been on shows together for nearly 10 years. And people I've worked with much more recently, I've just started to you might say, scratch the surface in terms of what I might be able to provide them and vice versa. Yep. I think that you're right. Like, selfishly, I can certainly say that I help sharpen these people's swords. But I'd be foolish to think that they're not providing the listener, the viewer, with what they truly need in a recognizable fashion. It takes a village, and I'm just a part of that village. For example, on a show like Get Up, there are literally dozens of people, as you might expect or imagine, on a daily basis that contribute to that show being what it is. I'm merely one of them. And I just happen to be someone fortunate enough that gets just a little bit of public shine.
Yeah, and you do it well. So you just mentioned that you've written 3 books with Greeny. Let's go down that path for a little bit. So what's been the process for you and Greeny to go about this book writing projects so that you're able to weave today's current sports with today's sports fans?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's been a thrill for me. So I'll take you all the way back to the spring of 2020, when, at least here in the Northeast, we were really shut down, and Greeny called me with this book idea. He was like, you know what we should do? And I think this is an idea that was originally spawned in some board after show Get Up meeting when nothing was actually happening. Yeah. So everyone was just talking about random kickers from the 70s, as it were. But he said to me, we should write a book, and we should do it on who owns every number in sports, 1 through 100. Yeah. And that's truly what we did. So that was our first book. It was called Got Your Number. It was an idea that he had gotten elsewhere. And I'd like to think that we at least came close to meeting our mark and nailing that concept. But what we learned after writing book number 1 was that people were a lot more into the idea of sports debate than they were sports history, although people do love sports history. But what we wanted to do was do a better job of weaving the 2 concepts together, which spawned our second book, Got Your Answers, which is more of a page turner, a little bit more listy, a little more referencey, a little more who are the 10 best of this, who are the 5 worst of that, things of that nature. And so what we'd like to do in our third book, without spoiling too much of what we'll eventually announce, is very similar conceptually in terms of the way that we're presenting the information, ranking things of a certain variety, as you might expect when it comes to the major sports. So what we learned was that he and I have this not only treasure trove of information, of historical knowledge that we've accumulated over many years of watching and researching sports, but we also have the pulse on the sporting public by talking about it on TV and the radio every single day. And we felt it would be foolish not to maximize that. And that's exactly what we've done. And so I never thought that I would ever be someone that would author 3 books, one of which so far has been a New York Times bestseller, considering the longest thing I ever wrote was a 10,000-page paper for Dr. Phipps at one point, truthfully. But the Lord works in mysterious ways. I have so enjoyed the process. And honestly, when people ask me what it's been like, if they'd recommend, they do it if people are on the fence about writing it, I always say yes, because there's something so rewarding, not just about seeing your work on a, like in a proof of concept, meat and potatoes, piece of paper, you can touch it. Like that's, it's much more, to me at least, much more rewarding than being able to see something that you've written online. But it also, like, the journey of it is so incredibly rewarding because you learn so much along the way. You aim for perfection, and it winds up becoming this self-fulfilling prophecy where the more you do, the more you want to do it. And so I wouldn't be surprised if in my life I read a dozen of these. I had that much fun doing it.
That's great. So let's go back to that first book. So the numbers books. So do you have a favorite number? Do you have a favorite story out of that book?
A favorite number, favorite story. So as you might expect, because of my background, which is first and foremost sports research, my favorite chapters are actually 99 and 100 in that book. Not to spoil the ending, if you've not read it, but 99 is Wayne Gretzky.
Yeah.
Obviously, that's the number that he wore. He's the greatest hockey player that ever lived. And 100 is Wilt Chamberlain, the number of points he once scored in the game, which is something that no one will probably ever do again, right? Yeah. The reason I like those chapters so much is they're basically just a diatribe of the very best stats that numbers can buy about 2 of the most legendary figures in the history of sports. Let's illuminate the careers of these sports legends through the statistics that they accomplished. And so the reason I really like those 2 chapters, not only because it ends the book, but because it's very clever. Wilt Chamberlain didn't wear 100. He wore 13. We gave 13 to Dan Marino. the number 100 and the piece of paper that he held up in the locker room after that game, which he scored 100 points. It's one of the most indelible objects in the history of sports, as you well know. It's one of the most enduring images in the history of basketball. And so, just look, I could go any number of different directions with my favorite there, but I think it was a very attractive way to end the book and a very satisfying end of the project for me.
Yeah, it's a great book. I encourage our listeners to go out and buy it, and maybe sometime when Hembo's on campus, he does need to come back to campus. Maybe he could even sign it for you, but we'll leave that for another day. Hembo, I don't want to leave today's conversation without getting into your faith journey, because I think that's central to who we are at Cedarville and this podcast specifically. Can you share with us that faith journey, and then how you try intentionally to intersect your faith at ESPN?
Okay. I could obviously go on and on and on in answering this question. So I'll do the best I can to be succinct and spare you with all the boring details. But suffice it to say that because I chose to go to Cedarville when I was 18 years old, my faith journey was obviously exceedingly important to me and to my family. I grew up in a Christian home, have been a church member and attender for as long as I can remember. And like most people have at least vacillated somewhat in terms of my commitment to it, and would like to think now that I'm on, in a peak and not a valley. That's where things stand right now. But obviously my faith journey led me to Cedarville, and therefore the best years of my life. And what I can honestly tell you is that I didn't know it at the time. So there are probably a lot of disenchanted students there at the university right now, like there are at any university at any time.
Right.
And I can tell you that I was, at least at times, one of those students. But not to spoil the ending, but I think it's incredibly important for me to impart to that student, if you're listening right now, that there's a big picture thing at work that you might not know is at work. So at the time, I may have found certain rules to be restrictive or certain lifestyle patterns to be inhibitive. But in looking back, what I can say for sure is that the university and those in positions of power and those in positions of influence over me had my best interest at heart. Now, you asked me about my faith journey, but the reason I feel it's important to answer that question this way is because Cedarville was so central in that for me. I spent 4 years of my life there, away from home. I lived about 8 hours from Cedarville. I grew up in suburban Philadelphia. My mom grew up in the farmlands of Northwest Toledo, so I was familiar with the area, and it was very familiar and comfortable to me and for me for that purpose. But they were super important years in molding who I am now, even though I didn't know at the time that's what was happening. Yeah. But it truly was. It truly was happening. Like I was I was the kid who was often, as they call it then, scanning and scramming, because I couldn't actually spend an hour going to chapel every single day when I could have had better things to do. I'm not proud to admit it, but I was like that. I, like many people at Cedarville, may have struggled with their faith at time, whether it be before, during, or after their time at Cedarville. But what I like to impart on people that are listening to this is that it's all part of the journey. It's not always going to be rosy. It's not always going to be beautiful. And I'd like to say that the 4 years I spent there did go a long way in laying the foundation for who I am today, because now I live in a secular world. Now I work in a secular world. Like so many people that are attending Cedarville now, you might not be fortunate enough to spend your whole life working at a place where the vast majority of people that you work with are just like you, are God-fearing, Bible-believing Christians. That's it's an in the world, not of the world kind of approach that you have to take to working in the secular world. To answer this from a 30,000-foot view, the elevator pitch would be, it is my belief that there are any number of ways in which believers can impart their faith and influence others in this world in that capacity. The way that I choose to do it and believe is most valuable for me to do it first and foremost is by simply committing to excellence at my job as best I possibly can. That doesn't mean that I won't occasionally miss the mark. That doesn't mean that I won't occasionally do regrettable things. It is to say that on a daily basis, I do believe that the Lord wants us to commit to excellence, to reflect upon Him. And so if you happen to know that I'm a believer, which you certainly should, and Greeny often pokes fun at me on the air for my religious upbringing, because he's the furthest thing from it, but it's part of the yin and the yang on our show, and we certainly play up to that. I'm proud of it, and to be proud of it on national airwaves at least requires some courage, even though I've never received any pushback from ESPN, to be exceedingly clear. But there are many people that would not be comfortable doing so, and for many years I was not. But the further that you reach in your faith journey, and the more comfortable you reach communicating it, I can say that it has been very satisfying to receive the occasional note from someone that says something to the effect of, "Oh, I always thought you were a believer, but I didn't know for sure. Thanks for sharing that X, Y, or Z. Oh, you went to Cedarville? You must be a Christian. Yada, yada, yada. Yeah. Those are some of the most fond pieces of feedback that I ever received. So it was a very circuitous way to answer that part of your question. And I'm happy to follow up. But those were like my sort of stream of consciousness, the first things that came to mind when you asked me about my journey.
So to be on a spiritual journey like we are on, like we said earlier, it takes a village. So it takes people come alongside us to build into our lives, to challenge us, to correct us, and to encourage us. So who are some of those spiritual mentors? Who are some of your professional mentors who are helping to shape the Hembo who is today?
Sure. So as you might expect, professionally, there is no person that has been more influential in my career than Mike Greenberg, whom I believe is one of the very best people on the planet at doing what he does. And I would not be close to where I am in this profession and thus have the opportunity to have this platform if it were not for him. On the other side of the spectrum, someone that sort of threads that needle is Dan Orlovsky, whom I've worked with for 5 or 6 years now. I first met him when he came to New York to do Get Up, and he still does Get Up. But now we communicate, as you might imagine, on a variety of shows he does in a variety of capacities. And not only do I believe him to be one of the best NFL analysts ESPN has, but for some reason he chooses to value my football opinions implicitly. And he also happens to be a God-fearing man who is constantly sharpening my knife and keeping me on the straight and narrow. And I would say going back several years now, I had the opportunity to work with Jason Romano, who was at ESPN for many years as a producer, now does a lot of forward-facing work for Sports Spectrum. Right. And they had the opportunity to sit down with him for a little while back in the summer, I want to say, and we sort of reminisced about our ESPN days and talked about what it's like being a forward-facing Christian in this profession. I would say that it's not always easy, but I certainly wouldn't describe it as a hardship either. Like it's one thing, I feel like sometimes people will ask me questions in that manner as if I'm oppressed in some way. Nothing could be further from the truth. I mean, we live in America in the year 2024. There has never been a time on the planet, in my opinion, that has been better in terms of the when or the where to be a God-fearing, Bible-believing Christian than America in the year 2024. I'm thrilled by it. Like if you asked an early church Christian what it would be like to talk about being a believer on ESPN, they would tell you, that is a walk in the park. And I am more than happy to acknowledge that. But those are 3 people, both personally and professionally, that have gone a long way in shaping me here at ESPN.
Well, you lead me to my next question. And that is, as a sports fan myself, and I want to talk about Dan Orlovsky now as well. I mean,
sure.
Because he was a quarterback for my favorite team, the Detroit Lions. But I've noticed on TV, it seems, that more athletes and maybe coaches and maybe even broadcasters are more open about their faith. But I see it at the pro football level. I see C.J. Stroud, etc., proclaiming their faith. What do you see that's behind that? And do you see that? Do you see it to being true?
I see it to being true. A. And B, I think there's something of a Pied Piper effect, for lack of a better term. Once you see someone do it, and they do it successfully, for lack of a better term, not only do you feel like you can, but you feel empowered to do it in the future. So I think there is definitely that person is demonstrating their faith in a public manner. I share that faith. It would behoove me to do it because I think there would probably be natural, like, for lack of a better term, separation of church and state when it comes to, okay, you're on TV, you're talking about sports, talk about sports. And I understand that notion entirely, truthfully. Like in my case, ESPN's cutting my check. I'll adhere to whatever rules are put in place, put forth. Also, and this is something that I don't think is often discussed, there is so much beauty in the language of the Bible. And if your profession is talking about X, Y, or Z on television, on the radio, etc., having that kind of knowledge, having that kind of experience, having read the text, provides you an eloquence in speaking that very few who don't know it can obtain. In the multitude of counsel, there is safety. Just one example that I've used on the radio that isn't necessarily like a direct, here, I'm going to quote Proverbs 3, 5, and 6. I'm going to quote Ephesians 2, 8, and 9, etc. However, I'm going to quote Romans 5, 8. But what I'm saying is there's so much richness and beauty in the text. And if you can speak it, you will empower any conversation that you are having because there's so much relatability to things that were written thousands of years ago that are so much eloquent to any of the things that we write and say now. We have lost the beauty of language, and it's still a parrot. I memorized the King James Version of the Bible growing up. So if you hear me using the word thou or thee on the radio, that's why.
Yeah.
If that's the kind of thing that I'll reference. Those are the kinds of words that I will say. And it's the same things when it comes to some of these old hymns. I'll do the same thing there. To me, there's a beauty in the old text and the old language that we lack in the world today. And it's actually, for lack of a better term, a market advantage, being able to speak in that way, not just in modern terms.
Hey, but we are nearing the end of the podcast, but I do have a couple more questions I want to ask. And first is when I talk about Dan Orlovsky, for you personally, what was it like for you to see him actually pray on national TV after Damar Hamlin nearly lost his life in Cincinnati during the Buffalo Bills Cincinnati Bengals game a couple of years ago? What was it like for you to actually see that? Because that's rare on national TV.
Exceedingly rare and exceedingly powerful. So I'll say this about Dan. He's as genuine as they come. I as you might imagine, saw and heard lots of pushback from people saying something to the effect of, oh, this is just Dan Orlovsky being performative. What I can tell you for sure is that nothing could be further from the truth. Right? The reason I thought it was so powerful, and this was a comment made to me, I forget exactly who said this, but it struck me as so powerful specifically because there are so many people watching at that time in the audience that probably had never seen it before.
Right.
Like for me, like it's obviously an exceedingly common occurrence to see someone praying for another. However, what percentage of the NFL Live audience has never actually seen someone pray for another in any context, right? And so not only did Dan have the courage to do it, but of course, the fact that Damar Hamlin not only recovered and is playing in the NFL today is proof positive of there being enormous power in prayer. It was so powerful. It was an incredible moment for so many reasons. Not only did it quote unquote work, of course, demonstrating the power of prayer, but it was also an eye-opening experience for human beings that had never seen it done before. And to see someone with as much gravity as Dan Orlovsky and to be able to do it not on an Instagram reel, to be able to do it live on the air on linear television, to me, was a seminal moment for those of us who are not only Christians, but fans of sports. Yeah.
And doing it live on TV shows, in my mind, proves his authenticity.
Correct.
Because it can't be scripted. It's authentic. So
that's right.
So, Hembo, my final sports question to you is this. So I was listening, watching, I don't know what it was, but they were talking about you taking over the analytics for the New York Jets if the right football coach is hired next time coming up. So is that a possibility? And how could your analytics help the Jets on-field product? Because we know they need some help.
I'm not so sure that I can turn the Jets into a Super Bowl team. Although I would say this: if I wind up having the privilege of taking that job, and the Jets wind up winning it all, I think Greeny will probably
he'll love you.
Here's what I would say in an honest moment, truthfully. I've worked in this profession now, like I said, for more than 10 years, and I honestly love every day. It's truly a dream job. When I was at Cedarville, if you had told me I would do anything approximating this, I would have told you to be institutionalized because I didn't even know such a job existed. However, there is definitely an element to knowing the numbers, crunching the numbers, to where I've often asked myself, would I enjoy being on the other side? Would I enjoy actually being in the booth? Would I enjoy making personnel decisions? Would I enjoy drafting players? Would I enjoy making fourth down calls? Would I, et cetera, building scouting reports, things of that nature? And God's honest truth is the answer to that question is yes. Now, the Lord has blessed me with skills, and I've been abundantly blessed to be able to have this career. I don't know if it's a forever job or a for now job, but truthfully, if such an opportunity presented itself, I think the Lord makes most big decisions in life obvious. And so I would definitely enjoy seeing how the other half of the world lives, for lack of a better term.
Great answer. Great answer. So final question, Hembo, as you look at your life today in comparison to when you were a student here at Cedarville, how have you seen the Lord grow you personally and spiritually?
It's a great question, and it's a loaded one. I think the best and most specific way to answer that question is in the realm of priority. So as you might expect, as someone who is so career-oriented, I have over-indexed that in my life, at least in hindsight. That's not an uncommon thing, I wouldn't say, in one's early to mid-20s as they're cutting their teeth in any profession to do whatever they can to get ahead and so on and so forth. But obviously, you only have so much bandwidth, only so much charge. You can only charge up to 100%. And if 100% of that charge is coming in the world of your career, well, what that obviously means is that you are leaving short other things. What I can tell you is that the fact that I had 3 children in the last 2 years,
right,
twin girls and then another girl, that changes everything. And I have gone from being someone who cares deeply about his career and very little else to someone that cares deeply about his family first and foremost. And I would say the Lord blessing me with those children and imparting into me the wisdom and the knowledge that is required to be able to do that job, which is the most important job, the way that I'm now on a daily basis attempting to do that job, has so much allowed me to put the rest of my life and my faith and my career into perspective. I would say of all the things the Lord has provided me, at least recently, far and away, that is the single most important one. And I think that it has gone a long way in helping me reprioritize the things that I should care about. And I would say, looking back now, I definitely over-indexed in those ways. And now I'm trying to correct in these ways. And I'm sure someday I'll look back on, this year and say, well, I did that wrong. I did that wrong. But that's the point. The point is better tomorrow than today, better today than yesterday. And I would say from the perspective of my faith, prioritizing those 3 girls and, of course, my wife, the family that he has provided me, is most definitely the most important thing in my life today. And I've not always been able to say that. And I'm proud to say that I'm a changed man because of it.
That's a great answer. And very encouraging to hear that from you, Paul Hembakides. Let me speak real briefly to the listeners today. Paul is a graduate of Cedarville. Communication, sport management are areas of interest to him. Those are programs we have here at Cedarville. So if you're interested in studying those programs from a Christian worldview, I encourage you to visit Cedarville's website, cedarville.edu, and learn more about it. I can't guarantee that you're going to follow in Hembo's footsteps at ESPN, but I do say that the Lord will prepare you for whatever he has for you, what's next. So look at cedarville.edu to learn more. Hembo, I really appreciate the opportunity to meet you, talk with you for the first time, and for you joining me on the Cedarville Stories podcast. All the best to you as you follow the Lord's will in whatever he has you to do.
Pleasure's mine. God bless.
Thank you for listening to the Cedarville Stories podcast, brought to you by Cedarville University. Be sure to come back next week when we'll share another Cedarville story for God's glory.